Hi and welcome to Crash Course Catholicism, a podcast about Catholic teaching and why it makes sense. I'm your host, Caitlin West. Hey friends, welcome to our fourth episode in this deep dive into the question of God's existence. In our last three episodes, we looked at arguments for the existence of God. And in this episode, and in the next one, we're going to take a look at some common objections to belief in God. So arguments for atheism and how we might respond to them. We're going to start by tackling some of the kind of familiar rhetorical catchphrases that you might have heard in debates and casual conversations before moving on to some of the more substantial, meaty arguments against God's existence, including the argument that there is insufficient evidence for God, the argument from divine hiddenness, so if God is real, then why is he so hard to find, the problem of evil and suffering, and the argument that we have no need for God because science explains everything. Now, I want to flag at the outset that we are not going to get through absolutely every possible atheist objection to belief in God in these episodes. But what I am going to do is include as many links as possible in the show notes for people who want to go more deeply into these debates, because I think it is important to understand where atheists are coming from. The other thing that I want to flag is that throughout these next couple of episodes, we're going to be building up towards more and more compelling arguments for atheism. So if you listen to this first episode and you're like, oh, Caitlin, just reaching for low-hanging fruit here, well, just know that we're starting with popular arguments and we're building towards more substantial arguments. But at every stage, we're going to try to do these arguments as much justice as possible. Now, before we get into the arguments themselves, we need to address one claim that you might have heard some atheists make, which is that atheists actually don't need to prove their position at all. So you might hear someone say something like, well, the burden of proof is actually on the theist, because the theist is the one who is making a positive claim that God exists. I'm not making a claim. I just lack belief in God in the same way that you lack belief in Zeus or Bigfoot. If you want to convince me that God exists, then the burden of proof is on you. I'm not the one with something to prove. So this position is illustrated in an analogy by the philosopher Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell basically says, okay, imagine that someone tells you that there is a tiny china teapot floating in space orbiting the sun. And your response to this is to say, well, I'm not convinced that that teapot exists. And the person is like, okay, then prove it. Prove to me that the floating china teapot in space does not exist. Well, that would be clearly unreasonable. The burden of proof lies with the person who's making the claim, not with the person who doubts it. So Russell applies the same logic to belief in God. If you claim that God exists, you're the one who needs to prove it. The default rational position, according to him and according to many atheists, is disbelief or a lack of belief in God. So if you want me to believe in him, then you're the one who needs to provide evidence, not me. Now, in the case of the teapot, Russell's point is absolutely fair enough. No one should be expected to disprove every arbitrary claim that someone else happens to invent. No one would expect you to prove that fairies or a flying spaghetti monster or invisible unicorns don't exist. That would be completely unreasonable. Now, why would that be unreasonable? Well, for two reasons. First of all, because flying teapots and spaghetti monsters are random, outlandish claims. In other words, their existence, or the question of their existence, doesn't naturally occur to human beings. Most people are not walking around wondering if there is a flying spaghetti monster in the sky. It's a claim that kind of comes out of left field. There's nothing in the world around us that points directly or indirectly to the existence of a flying spaghetti monster. So the default rational position in relation to those things is a lack of belief in them. Now, secondly, because these are random and fantastical claims, no one seriously believes in them. They might invoke the spaghetti monster or the flying teapot to make a rhetorical point about religion, but no one is genuinely getting around believing that there is truly an actual teapot in space. In other words, these are not serious, genuine propositions that need to be refuted. Now, is God like this? Is God a random, fantastical claim that comes out of nowhere and that no one seriously believes in? Well, if we define God as a random old man who lives in the sky, kind of like Zeus, then yes, the existence of an old man sitting on a cloud with like a white beard chucking thunderbolts at people seems just as unlikely as a teapot in the sky. However, this is not what classical theists mean when they refer to God. So remember, at this point, we're not yet talking about a specific religion. At the moment, we are talking about the classical understanding of God as being itself, the intelligent, necessary first cause of everything that exists. This concept of God, first of all, it's not something random that arises apropos of nothing. This concept of God arises as a logical answer to life's deepest and most urgent questions. So questions like, why are we here? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is the universe ordered and intelligible and capable of sustaining life? These are serious questions that people from all walks of life have asked throughout history. They are natural human questions, and they have led countless people to the conclusion that there must be some intelligent first cause. So God isn't something random that someone like yoinked out of the air and demanded we all believe in. It's not like all humans are just naturally atheists and then some crackpot came along with the idea of a creator. Secondly, because belief in God is logical and it arises out of our natural human experience, billions of people throughout history have believed in God. God's existence is a serious and logical proposition made by countless intelligent people for good reasons. So if we're going to deny that proposition, then it's reasonable to expect that we would be able to articulate why. I think I've heard Trent Horn say this, that if you tell me that you don't believe in fairies, then I probably won't ask you why. But if you tell me that you don't believe in the moon landing or in the Holocaust, then it would be reasonable for me to ask you why and to expect you to have answers. And if your answer was, well, you're the one who's claiming that the moon landing happened, so the burden of proof is on you, well, that wouldn't be a very satisfying response. Not only because it feels a little bit too dismissive for something that is taken so seriously by so many people, but also because actually both people in that conversation are making a truth claim. One of them is saying the moon landing happened, and the other is saying the moon landing did not happen. Both people are making a claim. This is how the philosopher Paul Chamberlain puts it. He says, every truth claim, whether positive or negative, has a burden of proof. So if you say, I believe God does not exist, then you have just as much a burden of proof as someone who says, I believe God does exist. Even if you say, I'm not 100% sure if God exists, but overall I lean towards the belief that he doesn't. So in other words, even if your position is agnostic to some degree, it's still reasonable for me to ask, why do you lean towards disbelief? The atheist, or the atheist-leaning agnostic in this example, doesn't just lack belief in God. They actually have a positive belief and opinions that can be discussed. The only person who can genuinely claim that they truly have a lack of belief and nothing to prove is the person who says, I literally have no idea whatsoever. I withhold my judgment entirely. So like true, pure agnosticism. So when it comes to the question of God's existence, both theists and atheists are making claims that can be examined and explained and held up to scrutiny. So with that said, let's turn to some of the reasons why people might claim that God doesn't exist. Now, before we get to the really substantial arguments, let's first take a look at some of the kind of casual statements that you might hear in passing from an atheist at like a dinner party or maybe in like a soundbite on social media. Because some of these common catchphrases might sound like compelling arguments when we hear them in passing, but once we examine them, it becomes clear that they're more like rhetoric. So you might hear things like, well, people only believe in God because it gives them comfort. It's a way of reassuring yourself that life has meaning and we're not just floating in the void. Or they might say, religion is just something that people absorb from their parents or their community. Like, you only believe in God because you were raised that way, or you've been indoctrinated by your school or your culture. Or they might say, well, religion is something that we've outgrown as a human race. I mean, yeah, sure, lots of people believe in God, but in the past, lots of people believed in Zeus and Odin, and they believed that the earth was flat. Like, there are lots of things that we've outgrown, and religion is just another cultural delusion. So these kinds of arguments were popularized during the New Atheist movement in like the early noughties. So the New Atheists are people like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens. Now, these arguments can be very emotionally powerful, especially when they're delivered with a lot of force and conviction. When we hear them, we can start to feel kind of rattled and anxious and even a bit ashamed. We might start thinking, oh my gosh, like maybe it's true. Maybe everyone who believes in God is a deluded idiot. And maybe I'm completely naive and there's no foundation for my belief in God. Now, it's worth paying attention to those emotions, because that emotional response is exactly the point of rhetorical statements like these. The effect of this kind of rhetoric is to make belief in God sound silly or naive, like something that no intelligent person could take seriously. But making something sound stupid is not the same as proving that it's wrong. So to illustrate the point, let's see what happens when we take those exact same statements and we replace the words God and religion with the scientific method. So imagine if I said, oh, well, the scientific method is just something that people turn to because it's comforting. It's a way of making sense of the world, and they only believe in it because they've been indoctrinated by their school or their parents. In the past, people believed in using leeches and alchemy. The scientific method is just another phase that we've outgrown. Now, in making those statements, have I just proven that the scientific method is false? No. Not at all. I've just made science sound stupid. But let's take a look at what these statements actually prove. If we take the statement, people only believe in science because it's comforting or they learned about it at school, I mean, that's true in one sense. It is true that people can find comfort in science and they learn about it at school, but that doesn't prove that it's false. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. Science can be both comforting and true. All we've proven is that maybe some people don't have very good reasons for believing in science. It's also true that people in the past have used whacked out scientific practices like bloodletting. But that doesn't mean that all scientific methods are therefore invalid. I can't just cast doubt by association and then call it an argument. So in the same way, if we say people only believe in God because it's comforting, I mean, side note, in my personal experience, it's pretty rare to find a faithful adult Christian who only believes in God because it's comforting, partly because Christianity is often not comforting. It demands a lot. But even if that were true, that doesn't prove that there's no God. The most that it proves is that some people have bad reasons for believing in him. Another example of a common rhetorical flourish is when people say, well, as an atheist, I just believe in one God fewer than you do. You believe in, for example, the Christian God, but you're an atheist with regard to all the other possible gods. Well, I'm just an atheist with regard to your God too. We're actually very similar. I just believe in one God fewer. Now, I love the way that Joe Heschmeyer puts it. He's an apologist for Catholic Answers. He uses the analogy of the question, who wrote Shakespeare's plays? This is an analogy after my own heart. So some people believe that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare. Maybe Marlowe did, or Ben Jonson, or maybe there was like a cabal of people who all wrote the plays. Now, imagine if I said to you, well, you believe that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. I just believe in one playwright fewer than you. I believe that no one wrote Shakespeare. That would be kind of a ridiculous thing to say, because there's a huge difference between saying Marlowe or Shakespeare or Ben Jonson wrote the plays and saying no one wrote them. In the same way, there's a huge difference between people who have different religious beliefs and someone who believes that there is no God at all. Now, I want to make it clear that there are many atheists who would look at the rhetorical devices and catchphrases we've just covered and say, these are not good or serious arguments for atheism. Like, the point here isn't to represent these as like good arguments or the best arguments that all atheists would use or support. In fact, in general, when we look at the people who are engaging in public debates around the existence of God these days, on both sides, the general consensus seems to be that these kinds of rhetorical tricks and flourishes are not helpful. The new atheist movement was very kind of emotionally charged and it used a lot of rhetoric, but it's kind of fallen out of favor these days for good reason, because I think people realize that it's better to engage respectfully with people and with the arguments themselves rather than taking cheap shots. So the reason why we're talking about these common catchphrases right now isn't because they're the best arguments or even good arguments, but because they still tend to come up in informal social situations. Well, like if you go head to head with a 19-year-old who just read The God Delusion. So it's good to be aware of them. And in particular, it's good to remember that if you're ever in a conversation with someone about anything, including about religion, if you're ever in a conversation with someone who's making your beliefs sound ridiculous and silly and naive, then it's good to stop and ask yourself, okay, what is the actual logical argument here? What are they proving? Are they making an argument, or are they just using rhetorical language to make my position sound stupid? Okay, now that's enough of new atheism and rhetoric. Blech. Let's turn away from that and take a look at some popular arguments for atheism. Now, perhaps the most common popular argument is simply that there is not enough or even any evidence for the existence of God. Now, when we hear that argument, the first thing we have to do is ask, well, what do we mean by evidence? Because we can mean a couple of things by this. Some people, when they say there's no evidence, are referring to physical, empirical evidence. So I remember one of my lecturers saying this at uni. He was like, look, if I can't measure it, if I can't see it under a microscope or do a scientific experiment to prove that it exists, then I don't believe that it exists. And of course, you can't put God under a microscope or detect his presence like you would detect radio waves. So for someone in this position, they would say there is no evidence for the existence of God. However, the question we then have to ask is, should we be looking for empirical evidence for the existence of God? Because not all methods of arriving at knowledge are useful for everything. So let's think about what science and empirical evidence are useful for. The point of science is to help us understand how the material world works. Science is all about measuring and harnessing and understanding matter. That is its remit. That's what it's for. But when we talk about God, we're not talking about matter. God is not a material being within the world that we can measure or conjure up with an experiment. He is immaterial by definition. Thomas Aquinas defines God as ipsum esse subsistens, which is Latin for subsistent being itself. God is being, which is a metaphysical reality. It's not a material reality. So for that reason, using science to try to prove God's existence is like trying to use mathematics to prove that my mother loves me. Rather than using science and looking for empirical evidence, we need to turn to other, more appropriate methods to discover him, like philosophy and theology, because these are the disciplines that deal with non-material metaphysical entities and concepts. Now, some atheists do accept that God is immaterial and that we can't use science to prove his existence, but they still maintain that there is insufficient philosophical evidence for him. Now, in this case, a couple of things may be happening. Sometimes it's a case of misunderstanding the evidence. So for instance, a lot of people misread Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways and kind of dismiss them on those grounds. So people like Richard Dawkins and even Bertrand Russell seem to assume that when Thomas Aquinas says that an infinite chain of causes is impossible, they seem to assume that he's talking about a temporal series of causes, and they dismiss the argument on that basis. But actually, Aquinas is talking about a hierarchical series of simultaneous cause and effect, which is a completely different ballgame. So in some instances, we can see someone dismissing an argument or a set of arguments as insufficient because they have misinterpreted them or misread them. At other times, though, It's literally just a matter of someone straight up not being convinced by the evidence. So for example, this is something that I've heard the atheist Alex O'Connor say. He's like, there are many wonderful arguments for the existence of God. It's just that none of them is enough to push me over the line into belief in God. And here, it's worth pausing to consider how philosophical reasoning works. Because if you've listened to the last 3 episodes, you'll know that there are plenty of good arguments for the existence of God. And they're not like whacked out crazy theories that no one believes in. These are serious, reasonable philosophical proofs. However, just because a philosophical argument is rational and logically structured, that doesn't mean that we have no choice but to accept it. It's not like with empirical evidence where you can point to something that's under the microscope and say, yep, there it is, and you basically don't have much room to move because the thing is right in front of you and that's that. When we're dealing with metaphysical questions and invisible realities, our freedom and our reasoning come much more into play. We have to engage our intellect to kind of weigh up the evidence and make a judgment about whether we find an argument convincing. And we do this whenever we're doing philosophical reasoning, not just in relation to God and the existence of God. This is the nature of philosophical reasoning. 2 reasonable people might look at the same argument and come to different conclusions about whether its premises are true or whether it really proves what it sets out to prove. So there's this famous debate between the philosophers Bertrand Russell and Father Frederick Copleston about the existence of God. You can find it on YouTube, I'll put it in the show notes. But there's this moment in the debate where they've been going back and forth over the question, why does the universe exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? And Father Copleston keeps pressing this question. He's like, why is there something rather than nothing? We need to be able to answer that question philosophically. And Bertrand Russell keeps pushing back and saying, well, I don't feel the need to even ask that question. It's not a compelling question to me. The universe is just there, and that's all. And eventually they get to this point where they have to agree to disagree. And they agree to disagree in the most deliciously British way possible. I encourage you to listen to it. But they reach this impasse because it's not a matter of just coming up with more and more kind of empirical proof until someone is compelled to give up their position. Both of these philosophers have access to the same information. It's just that one of them finds this question, why is there something rather than nothing, compelling, and the other one doesn't. And that's the nature of philosophical reasoning. We are free human beings with an intellect that we can use to make decisions about what we believe or accept or disbelieve. Now, this doesn't mean that it's not possible for us to arrive at certain conclusions or certain knowledge about things. But it does mean that philosophical reasoning is not just a matter of definitively empirically proving something once and for all so that there's no room to move. We always have freedom to make decisions about what we accept or reject. So when someone says, I've heard all the evidence for God's existence and I don't find it compelling, sometimes it is about clarifying the arguments or going more deeply into it with them. But at other times, there is a point when we have to respect the freedom and judgment of that other person. Now, that's not to say that we're relativists and we just throw our hands up and say, well, if that's what's true for you, then that's what's true for you. No, we can maintain that that person is wrong. But at times, maybe we need to back down from debate and focus on just cultivating our friendship with that person, partly out of respect for them and partly in acknowledgement of the fact that, especially from the point of view of a Christian, belief in God is ultimately about more than just philosophical reasoning. It's not just an intellectual exercise. I feel like I've said this 100 million times, but that's because it's such an important point. God is not an idea. Belief in God has to involve a personal relationship with Him at some point. And maybe what this person needs right now is not more rational arguments. Maybe they've heard them all. Maybe what they need is to meet God personally. Like, imagine if you had a friend and you were just convinced that she would be perfect for your brother. So every day you say to your brother, hey, I've got this friend and I think you would really like her. You're telling him all about your friend and all her good qualities and how she's fun and kind and intelligent. And your brother is like, yeah, I get it. Like, she sounds great. I'm just not that interested. Like, I'm busy with work. She sounds nice. I just don't think she's for me. And then one day, your brother meets your friend in person at a party, and that's the moment when he falls in love with her. And suddenly all your rational arguments for why they would be perfect together make so much more sense because now he's met her. So perhaps what a person in this position might need isn't so much more rational arguments as it is to meet Christ. We've talked about this in previous episodes, that sometimes when you've reached the limits of rational argument and you're still not convinced or you're not sure, it can be helpful to just try praying or going to adoration, seeing how you find it. I also remember a friend saying to me once that maybe for some people, the only time when they will ever read the gospel is when they read the book of your life. Like maybe the only way that some of our friends will encounter Christ is through our friendship with them. And that friendship might do more than arguing round and round and round in circles ever will. Now, this leads us to another objection, which is divine hiddenness. So what happens when someone is open to believing in God and to encountering him personally, but they just can't seem to get there? If God exists, then why does he sometimes make it so hard for us to find him? So this is how the atheist Ben Watkins puts it. He says, God's perfect goodness and perfect love imply that he would always be open to relationship. If God is always open to relationship, then every finite person believes God exists unless they are somehow resisting such a belief. Therefore, if perfect being monotheism is true, then there are no non-resistant non-theists. But there are non-resistant non-theists. Therefore, it follows that perfect being monotheism is false. Okay, so basically what he's saying is that if God is truly good and he wants to be in relationship with us, then why is it that there are people in the world who are open to relationship with him? Because we're not talking about people who've rejected God. People who are actually open to him, they are what he calls non-resistant non-theists, and yet God does not reveal himself to them. Surely God would never remain hidden from someone who is open to a relationship with him. Now, the too easy and kind of unfair response to this argument would be to say, well, if you haven't encountered God, then that's because you actually aren't open to a relationship with him. You say that you are non-resistant, but you must actually be harboring some resistance to him. You say that you are non-resistant, but you must actually be harboring some resistance to him, because God would never hide himself from someone who genuinely wants to know him. Now, I don't think that that's a helpful response. We can't ever make a judgment about the state of a person's heart or whether or not they're truly open to God. If someone says that they're open to knowing God, then we should assume that they genuinely are. So the next question is, for that open person, why haven't they encountered God yet? Well, first of all, a key word in that sentence is yet. If we are defining God as all-powerful and all-knowing and existing beyond time and space, then it follows that he can have plans that take into account the whole of a person's span of life. If he has made us for eternity in heaven with him, then surely his goal is not so much for every single person to be explicitly Christian from birth until death in this life, because this life is not the final destination, it's the pathway. If his goal is for us to get to heaven, then that path to heaven is going to be different for different people because we're not all the same. So for some people, God might reveal himself very tangibly to them at a very young age because that's what they need. But maybe for someone else, maybe God knows that if little Johnny is baptized Christian and goes to a Christian school and is really fervent, then that's all going to fall apart once he gets to university and he's never going to want to go back there again. So maybe it's better for him to trundle along as a non-resistant non-theist for most of his life until he has that health scare when he's in his late 50s and starts asking questions. I mean, if we are defining God as all-knowing and all-powerful, then it makes no sense for us in the next breath to say, well, God must behave in this way, according to my limited personal knowledge and understanding. And if he doesn't behave in that way, then that means he doesn't exist. If we are granting the idea of an all-knowing, all-powerful God, then we also have to grant that he might behave in ways that don't always seem clear or obvious to us. Now, we might hear that and think, okay, so sometimes God reveals himself to people later in life because that's what they need. But what about people to whom God never reveals himself? What about that kid who lives in the jungle and never meets a Christian ever in his life? Again, here we have to remember that we are defining God as the all-powerful creator of the universe. Just that we are defining God as the all-powerful, unlimited creator of the universe. Just because he isn't explicitly revealing himself to someone as God, that does not mean that he's not entering into relationship with that person. In previous episodes, we've talked about how God is present in the world in beauty, in nature, in the moral law, in our conscience. And yes, at least as Christians, we believe that the only way to get to heaven is through relationship with Christ. But there may be people who are developing a relationship with Christ without realizing it, and they reach the gates of heaven and God is finally revealed to them and their reaction is one of recognition. It's like the road to Emmaus. It's like, oh my gosh, this is the person who has been accompanying me kind of behind a veil my whole life. He's the one that I've been walking with and I didn't even realize it. Now we might hear that and think, okay, but surely it would be better for God to just like come down from the clouds and explicitly reveal himself to every person. But again, that's not necessarily true. Like if we return to the road to Emmaus, it makes sense that God remains disguised in that moment because he's trying to draw these apostles out, and he wouldn't be able to do that, to explain the scriptures to them, if he just immediately revealed himself as Jesus to them. Or it makes me think of the time when I first met my goddaughter. I hadn't been able to meet her in person until she was like 6 months old because of COVID. So by the time I did meet her, I was so excited that I like ran towards her with my arms outstretched. Poor little Aggie Maggie took one look at this overexcited stranger running towards her and she just burst into tears. And then for about a year after that, every time she saw me, she started crying. It was the worst. Or we can think of someone who has been indoors their whole life and they've never seen sunlight. And then suddenly you just shove them outside and all they could feel is agony because the sun is in their eyes. It's not always good for good things to be suddenly revealed to us. Like in both these cases, we're talking about good things. Sunshine, a loving but slightly over-enthusiastic godmother. God is the best thing of all. But also, maybe he knows that if we were exposed to the full force of his divine goodness in one go, we would disintegrate on the spot. It's like if you tipped the entire ocean into a small hole in the sand in one go, the hole in the sand would disintegrate. So instead, God introduces himself to us bit by bit, like pouring one bucketful into the hole at a time, letting it sink in. Maybe God sometimes walks alongside us in disguise, so as to reveal himself more fully to us later on. I think the most that the argument from divine hiddenness proves is that God can be really difficult to understand. He is to some extent mysterious, and it's okay for us to feel that frustration, to say, I don't understand why God would behave in this way. Why can't I see him clearly? Why am I struggling with these things? God is weaving a tapestry that we can only see the back end of, and sometimes that back end looks like a mess. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't have a plan, much less that he doesn't exist. It just means that he's bigger than any of us, which is, in fact, exactly how we would define God, as a creator who is beyond what we can fit neatly into our finite heads. Okay, that is definitely all we have time for today. In our next episode, we're going to continue this conversation about objections to God's existence. Great. Okay, well, such fun. I hope you have a fantastic fortnight. Thanks for sticking with me, and I will talk to you next time. Okay, bye. Hey friends, thanks for listening to this episode. If you are enjoying the podcast and you would like to see it continue and reach many more people, then I invite you to consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the show notes of this episode. There are many running costs associated with running a podcast, and I rely 100% on the generosity of patrons. Thank you so much to those who already support the podcast. And most importantly, please continue to pray for me and for all of those who are listening.